Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about how China and the US are sleepwalking towards conflict. The renowned international relations scholar, Allison, said that the US believes the Chinese are encroaching on every privilege at the top of America's pecking order. The US is in a state of deep fear. In this struggle between China and the US, the Chinese might not fully understand why Americans keep taking such tough actions against China. Isn't the US still far ahead of China in technology, finance, military, and the economy? So why is it so afraid? Why is it being so ruthless? The famous American international relations scholar, Allison, once predicted that China and the US are heading towards the Thucydides' trap of mutual destruction, where an established power simply cannot accept the challenge from a rising power. He once estimated that there would be a war between China and the US. Recently, Tencent News took the opportunity of Allison's new book, Destined for War: Can America and China Escape the Thucydides Trap?, to interview him and ask for his comments on the current state of US-China competition. According to Allison, China is now surpassing the US across the board. The US used to be ahead at every key point in the world, but now it simply can't accept the reality that these advantages are disappearing one by one. Allison said, "Just think about China and the US today. Is China still rising, or has it already risen? Yes, China is developing faster and more comprehensively than any other country in history. China has already grown strong, and it will continue to develop." So what does this mean for the US? China wants to achieve its own dreams, but in the eyes of Americans, this inevitably means encroaching on the positions and privileges that the US has long held. The defining feature of current US-China relations is fierce competition, and this is expected to continue for the foreseeable future. So, a rising China is now seeking the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. China has built up the efforts of an entire generation, and it will keep rising, becoming even stronger. From the American perspective, China's competition threatens to undermine the US's position as the dominant power. Americans have always believed that they naturally deserve to be at the top of the pecking order. Let's listen to how Allison compares the current situation between China and the US from different perspectives. First, on the economy, Professor Allison uses the image of a power seesaw as a metaphor to vividly illustrate the comparison and fundamental shift in strength between China and the US. For the US, the economic data is truly alarming. Allison compares the US and China to two skinny people sitting on either end of a seesaw in a park, with their size measured by their respective GDPs. However, he believes that GDP should be calculated based on purchasing power parity, rather than the usual method of converting each country's economic output into US dollars for comparison. Purchasing power parity compares the economic strength of countries by looking at how much their own currency can buy within their own markets. In the annual assessment of national economic strength, the CIA explained why they abandoned the usual market exchange rate comparison and switched to using purchasing power parity as the measurement standard. According to the CIA, calculating GDP using the official US dollar exchange rate greatly underestimates China's actual output level compared to the rest of the world. If calculated by purchasing power parity, China's GDP in 2004 was about half of the United States. 20 years later, by 2024, China has already risen to at least 1.5 times the size of the US economy, and its total economic output has long surpassed that of the United States. On the power balance scale, there has been a fundamental shift in the comparison between China and the US, and most importantly, the heaviest player has changed from the US to China. For the United States, these economic figures are truly shocking. With the changes in GDP, the balance of power between the two countries has undergone a structural transformation. As a result, the global trade landscape has been completely reshaped. At the beginning of the 20th century, the US was the main trading partner for all countries, but now this position has been taken over by China. In 2018, 130 countries had more trade with China than with the US, and for more than two-thirds of those countries, their trade volume with China was more than double that with the US. By 2001, China had become the main trading partner for almost every country. A generation ago, the United States was the world's factory, but today, that title belongs to China. Inevitably, China has become stronger, wealthier, and more influential. Second, international relations. These structural changes are dramatically reshaping the international order. The US-led unipolar era has come to an end, and the concept of spheres of influence has returned. Former Singaporean leader Lee Kuan Yew once said that in the 20th century, the legitimacy of leaders increasingly depended on their ability to improve the economic well-being of their people. Allison said that's why America's allies and friends often say, "Don't force us to choose sides between the US and China." The US is crucial to our security, while China is essential to our prosperity. Allison believes that, therefore, it's not surprising that China uses business as its primary tool to advance its interests around the world. Just as Quill and Harris made a convincing argument in their book Another Kind of War. China is the world's leading practitioner of geoeconomics. In plain language, this means China uses its economic influence to build connections with countries around the world, because leaders everywhere want to strengthen economic and trade ties with China to improve their own citizens' livelihoods and boost their own legitimacy. Third, technological competition. In December 2021, Professor Allison's team published a report tracking the rise of China's technological strength and comparing its relative power to the United States in many fields. The conclusion was that China has made a huge leap forward and is now a comprehensive, equal-level competitor to the US. Allison said that 21 years ago, the US couldn't even see China in its rearview mirror, because China was actually too far behind. Today, the US still can't see China in its rearview mirror, because China is now on par with the US, and has even slightly surpassed it. They examined the entire field of technology, and conducted in-depth research into 6 cutting-edge technologies, such as 5G, artificial intelligence, quantum technology, synthetic biology, and so on. The research found that, basically, China has made huge leaps in almost every scientific field, becoming a competitor that the US must take seriously. Just as Tarun Chhabra, Senior Director for Technology and National Security at the US National Security Council, has assessed, the US is no longer the global technology hegemon. William Burns, director of the CIA, once said that technology is the main battleground in the competition and confrontation between the US and China. Take chips as an example. Semiconductors are pretty much the only manufacturing sector where the US still has China in a chokehold. But Allison completely disagrees that the US can strangle China with semiconductors. On the contrary, he believes China will become more and more dominant. Although the leading chip companies are NVIDIA, Qualcomm, and Intel, all American firms, Allison thinks that the US has held its dominant position in the semiconductor industry for nearly half a century, but this position has been gradually weakened by insufficient domestic investment and intensified overseas competition. Although the US is still ahead in chip design, its share in semiconductor manufacturing has dropped from 37% in 1990 to just 12% today, while China has the potential to become a leader in the semiconductor industry. Allison says that we must not underestimate China's potential, nor should we deny this reality. Moreover, if things keep going the way they are, China is even more likely to achieve its goal of becoming a top player in the semiconductor industry before 2030. China's semiconductor output has already surpassed that of the US, with its share of global production rising from less than 1% in 1990 to 15% today, while the US share has dropped from 37% in 1990 to just 12% now. From 1990 to 2020, China built 32 large semiconductor factories, while all other countries combined only built 24, and the US didn't build a single one. Among China's top semiconductor manufacturers, SMIC has consistently ranked among the top 5 foundries in the past decade. In 2020, it made a breakthrough by achieving the 7nm N+1 process, which means its advanced manufacturing capabilities can already rival Intel. In the field of chip design, Huawei's subsidiary HiSilicon has grown into a top integrated circuit designer. Although export controls have hurt the company's short-term prospects, in 2022, HiSilicon became the first Chinese company to break into the global top 10 semiconductor companies and replaced longtime market leader Qualcomm as China's largest smartphone processor supplier. Although China still relies on imported semiconductors to meet 85% of its domestic demand, its recent achievements have challenged the long-held belief that China's semiconductor industry could never catch up to global standards. Allison said that although recent US sanctions against Huawei and the addition of SMIC to the Entity List have slowed China's progress, the US cannot stop the development of China's semiconductor industry. It cites a prediction from the U.S. Semiconductor Industry Association that, in the next 10 years, China will develop 40% of the world's semiconductor production capacity and become the largest semiconductor manufacturer in the world, holding 24% of the global market share. After reading Allison's analysis, there are a few conclusions. First, his estimation of China's future development aligns perfectly with my own views. China is surpassing the U.S. one field after another, and America's attempts to hold China back won't stop its progress. Second, Allison believes that although China and the U.S. have fallen into the Thucydides trap, meaning there is a high risk of war and both sides could sleepwalk into conflict at any time, if both parties can manage the competition well and emphasize coordination, dialogue, and cooperation on shared interests, then this trap can be avoided. Third, I think China needs to maintain a bottom-line mindset. China doesn't want to go to war with the U.S., but China has both the mindset and the capability to stand tall and strong. By gradually surpassing the U.S. militarily, China can suppress America's impulse to use force.